David Ramirez saw it through his Bushnell binoculars at 7:43 p.m., just as the Wyoming sun dropped behind the Absaroka Range and turned Yellowstone's thermal features into pools of liquid shadow. A figure moving across the Norris Geyser Basin, 2 miles distant, silhouetted against the steam rising from Porcelain Basin. The movement was wrong. Too fluid, too fast, covering ground in a way that suggested the figure wasn't walking but gliding, bones articulating in directions human joints didn't allow. David adjusted the focus, his hands unsteady. 3 months into his first season with the National Park Service, and he still got nervous doing basic observation duty. The senior rangers made it look effortless, scanning terrain, identifying hazards, maintaining situational awareness across vast distances. David felt like he was perpetually catching up, always one step behind where he should be. The figure crossed a boardwalk section that David knew was at least 300 yards long. It covered the distance in what looked like seconds, moving with that impossible fluidity. Through the binoculars, David could make out details that made his breath catch. The figure was skeletal, not thin but actually composed of bone, visible ribs and exposed skull, moving independently of any flesh that should connect them. David lowered the binoculars, blinked hard, raised them again. The figure was gone. Just empty boardwalk and rising steam and the last red light of sunset turning everything the color of old blood. "You see something?" David jumped, nearly dropping the binoculars. Sandra Kim stood behind him, the senior ranger who'd been assigned to mentor him through his first season. She was mid-40s, Korean-American, 15 years with Yellowstone, and possessed the calm competence that David desperately wanted to develop. "I thought I saw someone out on the Norris Boardwalk," David said, hating how his voice wavered. "But they were moving really fast. Probably just the light playing tricks." Sandra took the binoculars, scanned the geyser basin with practiced efficiency. "Norris is closed after sunset. Gates should be locked. You sure you saw someone?" I think so. But the way they moved was weird. Could have been a shadow, or steam patterns." Sandra lowered the binoculars, her expression neutral, but David could read the assessment happening behind her eyes. "New ranger, nervous, seeing things in the twilight. Probably just needs more field time to develop confidence. We'll do a sweep in the morning," Sandra said. "If someone violated closure, we'll find evidence. Footprints off the boardwalk, disturbed mineral deposits. Happens sometimes. Tourists think rules don't apply to them." David nodded, feeling stupid. His first potential violation report, and he was already doubting what he'd seen. This was exactly the kind of thing the senior rangers probably joked about in the break room. Rookie getting spooked by shadows, calling in phantom intruders. They were stationed at the Norris Backcountry Patrol Cabin, a small structure 3 miles from the geyser basin, positioned to monitor one of Yellowstone's most volcanically active areas. The park sat atop a supervolcano, a caldera 45 miles across that had last erupted 640,000 years ago. The ground here was thin, stretched tight over magma chambers that constantly shifted and heated, creating the thermal features that made Yellowstone famous. David had studied the geology obsessively during his training, trying to compensate for inexperience with knowledge. He knew that Norris was the hottest thermal area in the park, with water temperatures exceeding 199 degrees in some features. He knew the ground could be unstable, that boardwalks existed because stepping off them could mean breaking through acidic crust into boiling water. He knew that Yellowstone killed several visitors each year, usually tourists who ignored warnings and paid for their arrogance with their lives. What he didn't know was how to trust his own observations, how to differentiate between genuine threats and the anxiety his mind generated when confronted with vast responsibility. Inside the patrol cabin, Sandra heated MREs on the propane stove while David updated the daily log on his laptop. Standard entries, weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance issues noted during the day's patrol. He hesitated before adding, 20:43 hours, possible unauthorized person observed in Norris Basin after closure. Area to be inspected at first light. His phone showed 2 bars of signal, decent for backcountry Yellowstone. In 2019, the park had finally upgraded its cellular infrastructure. installing towers that provided coverage in many previously dead zones. David pulled up the Yellowstone thermal monitoring app, checking real-time data from sensors throughout Norris. Ground temperatures were elevated, which was normal. Seismic activity showed the usual micro-earthquakes that happened constantly as the caldera breathed. Nothing anomalous. Except the temperature readings from Porcelain Basin were spiking. Several sensors showing increases of 15 to 20 degrees in the past hour. Not dangerous levels, but unusual for the time of day when thermal features typically cooled slightly. "Sandra, look at this." David turned the laptop so she could see the monitoring data. She studied the graphs, her expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention. "That's weird. Porcelain doesn't usually show that kind of increase in the evening. Could be a sensor malfunction or actual hydrothermal changes. We should report it." Sandra used the satellite phone to call the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory, speaking to a geologist named Dr. Mitchell, who managed the monitoring network. David listened to one side of the conversation, hearing Sandra describe the temperature spikes with technical precision. After she hung up, Sandra looked troubled. "Mitchell says they're seeing similar anomalies across multiple thermal areas. Started about 3 hours ago. He's sending a team out tomorrow to recalibrate sensors and take direct measurements. Wants us to do visual observation tonight if conditions allow. Document any unusual thermal activity." David felt a spike of anxiety. Night observation meant going back out, getting closer to the area where he'd seen the impossible figure. Part of him wanted to refuse, claim fatigue or equipment issues, but another part, the part that had wanted to be a ranger since childhood, that had studied wildlife biology and wilderness management and emergency response, knew that this was the job. The park didn't pause its dangers because a ranger was nervous. They geared up with headlamps, thermal imaging camera, portable weather station, and emergency communication equipment. Sandra carried a Glock 21, standard NPS issue. David had qualified with the weapon during training but still felt uncomfortable carrying it, hyper-aware of the weight on his hip. The walk to Norris took 40 minutes through darkness that felt absolute. Yellowstone at night existed in a void of light pollution, the sky exploding with stars that David's suburban California childhood had never prepared him for. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, beautiful and somehow oppressive in its vastness, its reminder of how small human concerns were against cosmic scales. They reached the Norris parking area at 9:15 p.m. The gates were indeed locked, but Sandra had keys for park infrastructure. She opened the barrier and they proceeded onto the boardwalk system, their headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness. The thermal features transformed at night. During the day, they were geological curiosities, colorful hot springs, steaming vents, bubbling mud pots. At night, they became something primordial. Steam rose in ghostly columns. The sound of boiling water echoed across empty basins. The smell of sulfur hung thick in the air, that distinctive rotten egg odor of hydrogen sulfide gas escaping from deep within the earth. David's headlamp caught movement, just a shape in the darkness beyond his light's reach. He froze, heart hammering. "What?" Sandra's voice was calm, ready. Something moved, over by Steamboat Geyser. Sandra swept her light across the indicated area, nothing visible. She pulled out the thermal imaging camera, scanning the darkness. The screen showed hot spots, thermal features glowing white and yellow against the cool night, but no human heat signatures. "Probably wildlife," Sandra said. "Elk bed down near thermal areas in winter. Even in October, they're attracted to the warmth." But it wasn't winter, and elk didn't move the way that shape had moved, silent and predatory and focused. They continued along the boardwalk, documenting temperatures with a handheld infrared thermometer. Sandra was right. Most features showed elevated readings, 5 to 20 degrees above normal evening temperatures. The changes seemed random, affecting different springs and vents without pattern. At Porcelain Basin, the largest concentration of thermal features in Norris, the changes were more dramatic. Multiple springs that normally ran clear were clouded with mineral suspension, indicating underground disturbances. The smell of sulfur intensified to the point where David's eyes watered. Sandra photographed everything, her documentation thorough and professional. David tried to emulate her calm, taking readings and notes, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not the casual awareness of wildlife nearby, but the focused attention of something intelligent observing them with purpose. They were halfway through Porcelain Basin when David heard it. A sound like dry bones clicking together, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the darkness beyond the boardwalk. Click, click, click. Pause. Click, click, click. Like someone drumming finger bones against skull. "You hear that?" David whispered. Sandra cocked her head, listening. For a moment, silence, then the clicking resumed. Closer now, moving in a circle around their position. Sandra's hand moved to her Glock. "That's not wildlife." The clicking intensified, coming from multiple directions simultaneously. David spun, trying to track the sources, but his headlamp showed nothing, just darkness and steam and the pale boardwalk extending into shadow. Then his light caught something, a figure standing 30 yards away, just at the edge of his headlamp's reach. Skeletal. Definitely skeletal. Not a person in costume or an animal carcass, an actual animated skeleton, bones bleached white, empty eye sockets that somehow conveyed attention. David's training evaporated. He grabbed Sandra's arm, pointing. "There, do you see it?" Sandra's headlamp joined his, illuminating the figure more clearly. The skeleton was tall, 7 feet at least, with abnormally long limbs and a skull that seemed slightly too large. It held something in its bony hands. A bow, ancient-looking, made from what might have been bone or wood darkened by age. The skeleton raised the bow slowly, knocking an arrow that David couldn't see. Just the motion of drawing and aiming, but no visible projectile. "Run!" Sandra said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Back to the vehicle. Now." They ran. The boardwalk, designed to protect the fragile thermal features, created a single path with no alternate routes. Behind them, the clicking sound multiplied, accelerated, became a cacophony of bone against bone like a dozen skeletons applauding their retreat. David's lungs burned, from exertion, from the sulfur-heavy air, from pure terror. He joined the Park Service expecting danger from wildlife or weather or human stupidity. Not from animated skeletons that violated every principle of biology and physics he'd learned in 6 years of university education. They reached the parking area and practically fell into Sandra's patrol truck. She started the engine with shaking hands, reversed without checking mirrors, drove too fast down the access road toward the main park highway. Neither spoke for the first 5 minutes. David's mind spun, trying to construct rational explanations. Elaborate prank? Visitors in sophisticated costumes? Some kind of projected image? Nothing fit. The skeleton had been 3-dimensional, casting shadows in their headlamps, moving with the smooth coordination of living bone. Sandra finally broke the silence. "I saw it too. You're not crazy, and I'm not crazy, and we both saw the same impossible thing." "What was it?" "I don't know. But it was real. Physical. And it was hunting us." Sandra drove to the Norris Ranger Station, a larger facility with staff and communication equipment and the safety of other humans. She reported the incident to the shift supervisor, a 20-year veteran named Tom Whitman who listened with increasing concern. "You're sure it wasn't someone in costume?" Tom asked. "I know what costumes look like," Sandra replied, her voice steady despite the fear David could see in her eyes. This was skeletal. Actual bone, moving independently without musculature or connective tissue. Tom looked at David. "Can you corroborate?" David nodded. "I saw it first through binoculars at sunset, moving across the boardwalk. Then we encountered it again during the thermal survey. It had a bow. It was aiming at us." Tom pulled up the park's incident database, typing quickly. After a minute, he turned the monitor so they could see. "We've had 3 missing person reports in the Norris area over the past 15 years. All hikers, all disappeared at night, all near thermal features. One body was eventually recovered. Sophia Carr, 29, from Colorado. Found in 2017, 3 days after she was reported missing." He pulled up the case file. David read the details with growing dread. Sophia Carr had been an experienced hiker, properly equipped, hiking alone on a permitted backcountry trail that passed near Norris. She'd checked in via satellite phone at 6 p.m., reporting normal conditions. By morning, she'd missed her scheduled check-in. Search and rescue found her body 2 days later, a mile off trail, in an area of unstable thermal ground. The autopsy photos were clinical but horrifying. Multiple puncture wounds across her torso, arranged in patterns that suggested projectiles rather than animal bites. But no projectiles had been found, no arrows or bullets recovered from the body. The wounds had penetrated deep, damaging internal organs with precision that seemed almost surgical. Most disturbing was the final detail. Sophia Carr's liver was missing, removed with such care that the surrounding tissue showed minimal damage, as if excised by an expert surgeon. No explanation had been offered in the official report, though speculation ranged from animal scavenging to unknown human predation. Jesus, Sandra whispered. Those wounds match what that thing would cause. Arrows we couldn't see. Tom looked between them, clearly struggling with what to believe. I'm calling this interregional, and we're closing Norris until we can sweep the area in daylight with a full team. Whatever you saw, prank, costume, or... He trailed off, unable to articulate the alternative. David felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. He hadn't imagined it. But that meant the skeleton was real, which opened questions that shattered his understanding of reality. They spent the night at the ranger station, neither David nor Sandra willing to return to the isolated patrol cabin. Tom assigned 2 rangers to guard duty, which felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. What would guns do against animated bones? But human presence felt safer than isolation. David couldn't sleep. He pulled out his phone, searching for information about skeletal creatures and folklore. Most results were Halloween decorations and Day of the Dead imagery. But deeper searching found references to Native American traditions, specifically Ojibwe stories about Baycock. The Baycock was described as a skeletal spirit, the ghost of a warrior who refused to accept death. It hunted at night with a bow that fired invisible arrows, killing from a distance. The Baycock consumed the livers of its victims, drawn to the organ that the Ojibwe considered the seat of courage. It made sounds like rattling bones, announced its presence with clicking that preceded attacks. David read with mounting recognition. Every detail matched what they'd witnessed. But the Ojibwe were Great Lakes peoples, their traditional territories hundreds of miles east of Wyoming. Why would their mythology appear in Yellowstone? He dug deeper, finding academic papers about indigenous presence in the Yellowstone region. The land had been home to multiple tribes, Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, and others, for over 11,000 years before becoming a national park in 1872. The tribes had been forcibly removed, their sacred sites absorbed into park territory, their stories dismissed as primitive superstition by the white administrators who claimed the land. But trade routes had connected tribes across vast distances. Ojibwe traders had traveled west. Stories had spread, adapted, found new contexts in different territories, and Yellowstone itself was a thin place, geologically unstable, volcanically active, a landscape where the boundary between Earth's surface and the magma below was measured in miles rather than continents. What if the Baycock wasn't just Ojibwe mythology? What if it represented something that existed in multiple forms across multiple cultures? A spirit or entity that was drawn to places where death came easily, where the ground itself could kill, where humans were perpetually vulnerable. David presented his findings to Sandra and Tom at dawn. Sandra listened with the focus of someone whose worldview had shattered overnight. Tom remained skeptical, but couldn't dismiss the correlation between the folklore and what they'd witnessed. Even if we accept this theory, Tom said carefully, what do we do about it? How do you fight a skeleton spirit with invisible arrows? David pulled up more information. Traditional protections varied by culture. Some sources mention tobacco offerings, others suggest specific chants or rituals. But the most consistent element is fire. Most skeletal spirits in various mythologies are vulnerable to fire. It's the only thing that can permanently destroy bone. So we're supposed to what? Burn it? Sandra asked. assuming we can even find it during daylight? We don't have to find it, David said quietly. It'll find us. The Baycock hunted Sophia Carr. If the pattern holds, it's territorial. It hunts in its claimed area. We go back to Norris, and it'll come. That's insane, Tom said. I'm not authorizing rangers to hunt a supernatural entity based on folklore research by a 3-month rookie. Then what? David heard the frustration in his own voice. We close Norris indefinitely? How do we explain that to visitors? What happens when it moves to a different area, starts hunting elsewhere in the park? The argument continued through breakfast, but David could see Tom's resistance weakening. The reality was that something had killed Sophia Carr with impossible weapons, and now it was still out there, still hunting. Doing nothing meant accepting future deaths. By 10 a.m., they'd assembled a team. David, Sandra, Tom, and 2 other rangers, Lisa Hoffman and Stephen Torres, both veterans with extensive backcountry experience. They carried unusual equipment, thermal imaging, motion sensors, and 4 road flares each. Not ideal for fighting supernatural entities, but the closest thing to portable sustained fire they could justify from park supplies. The plan was simple to the point of stupidity. Return to Porcelain Basin, set up observation positions, wait for the Baycock to appear, then attempt to drive it off or destroy it with fire. If things went wrong, they'd retreat and call for more resources, though what resources could address an animated skeleton was unclear. They reached Norris at 11 a.m. Daylight made the area look normal, boardwalks winding between colorful thermal features, steam rising lazily in the morning sun, tourists snapping photos and reading interpretive signs. The normalcy felt like a lie. Tom cleared the area, citing increased thermal activity as justification for temporary closure. It wasn't entirely false. The temperature anomalies persisted, multiple features showing readings above normal parameters. By 2 p.m., the area was empty, except for their team. They positioned themselves at strategic points around Porcelain Basin, maintaining radio contact, documenting everything with handheld cameras. David occupied a position near Steamboat Geyser, the world's tallest active geyser, currently in a quiet phase between eruptions. His assigned sector included a boardwalk junction and 3 major hot springs. The isolation, even knowing 4 other rangers were nearby, felt absolute. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky. David's initial adrenaline faded into tedium, that dangerous state where attention wandered despite the potential threat. At 5:47 p.m., Lisa's voice crackled over the radio. I've got movement. Southwest corner, near Aquinas Geyser. Something's disturbing the steam patterns. David scanned his sector, seeing nothing unusual. Through his binoculars, he could just make out Lisa's position 300 yards away. Her body language read as tense, alert, tracking something he couldn't see from his angle. Then the clicking started. Faint at first, growing louder. That distinctive sound of bone on bone, rhythmic and deliberate. It's here, Sandra's voice, tight with controlled fear. I can hear it, but can't see it. David swept his binoculars across the thermal basin. The afternoon light created stark shadows, steam columns that obscured sightlines. Perfect hunting conditions for something that moved silently and attacked from a distance. A shape materialized near the boardwalk between David's position and Lisa's. The Baycock, fully visible in daylight, even more terrifying than the glimpses they'd caught at night. 7 feet tall, skeletal limbs that moved with fluid grace. Bones bleached so white they seemed to glow against the darker ground. It carried the bow, ancient wood or bone shaped by hands long dead. The skeleton turned its skull toward David's position. Empty eye sockets somehow conveyed intelligence, recognition, intent. David keyed his radio with shaking hands. I have visual. It's between positions 2 and 4. Moving. Shit. It's moving toward Lisa. The Baycock raised its bow, drawing back on a string David could barely see, knocking an arrow that existed more as concept than physical object. Lisa, take cover! David was already moving, abandoning his position, running along the boardwalk toward where the skeleton threatened his colleague. The Baycock released. David saw the motion, saw Lisa drop behind a protective boulder, heard her scream as something impacted the rock with force that sent stone chips flying. An invisible arrow, solid enough to damage stone, carrying kinetic energy that would tear through human flesh. Tom and Stephen converged from their positions, forming a loose perimeter around the baycock. The skeleton didn't retreat. It turned in a slow circle, skull tracking each ranger, calculating range and threat level. "On my mark," Tom's voice over the radio, steady despite the impossibility they faced. "Light flares in advance, drive it toward the main basin." David pulled a road flare from his pack, struck it against the igniter. The flare burst into brilliant red flame, chemical fire that burned at over 2,200 degrees. Around the perimeter, 4 more flares ignited, creating a ring of fire. The baycock reacted. For the first time, it showed something like emotion. The skull tilted back, jaw dropping open in what might have been a scream, though no sound emerged. It turned away from the flames, moving with that impossible speed toward the center of Porcelain Basin. "Advance," Tom ordered. They moved forward in coordinated formation, years of training overriding the terror of fighting something that shouldn't exist. The flares cast harsh red light, creating shadows that danced across the thermal features. The baycock backed toward a large hot spring, one of the deepest features in the basin, water temperature exceeding 180 degrees. It raised the bow again, firing rapid shots, invisible projectiles that forced the rangers to dodge and weave, disrupting their advance. David felt something pass his cheek, close enough to feel the air displacement. An invisible arrow, missing by inches. He stumbled, nearly fell off the boardwalk into fragile thermal crust that would collapse under his weight. Sandra reached him, pulled him back onto stable ground. "Stay focused. Don't look at it directly. Track its movements, not its eyes." Good advice. Looking into those empty eye sockets created a hypnotic effect, a sense of vertigo that threw off balance and judgment. They pressed forward, flares held high, driving the baycock toward the hot spring. The skeleton backed to the edge, bones inches from superheated water that would boil flesh in seconds. Not that it had flesh to boil. The baycock fired one final arrow. Stephen Torres cried out, falling, his left leg suddenly bleeding from a wound that appeared without visible cause. The invisible arrow had punched through his thigh, severing muscle and grazing bone. Lisa broke formation, running to Stephen, applying pressure to the wound while speaking into her radio. "Officer down. We need immediate medical evac." The baycock took advantage of the disruption. It turned and dove into the hot spring, bones entering superheated water that should destroy organic material instantly. But instead of dissolution, the skeleton sank beneath the surface and kept moving, descending into depths that should be impossible, disappearing into the hydrothermal system that connected Norris's thermal features to the magma chambers miles below. David ran to the spring's edge, looking down into water so hot it actually boiled, creating bubbles that rose through liquid that ranged from clear to milky white depending on mineral content. No sign of the baycock, no bones floating, no evidence it had ever been there except Stephen's bleeding leg and the stone chips where invisible arrows had struck. The helicopter evacuation took 30 minutes to arrive, 30 minutes of applying pressure to Stephen's wound while he remained conscious but in shock, talking about seeing arrows that weren't there, about the skeleton's empty gaze. They transported him to the hospital in Mammoth, where doctors documented a puncture wound consistent with a projectile, but complicated by the lack of any foreign material. No arrowhead, no bullet fragments, nothing that explained the damage. The team returned to Norris Ranger Station in silence. Tom filed an incident report that documented an animal attack of unknown origin resulting in ranger injury. Sandra submitted her photographs and thermal imaging data, all of which showed the baycock clearly. Skeletal figure, visible in multiple wavelengths, physical enough to show up on sensors, but composed of material that defied biological classification. David wrote his own report, including the folklore research, the correlation with Sophia Carr's death, the theory that the baycock was a spirit drawn to Yellowstone's thermal features, using the hydrothermal system as a kind of hunting ground or refuge. Tom read David's report with an expression of exhausted acceptance. You know this will never be officially acknowledged. The NPS doesn't investigate supernatural threats. Best case, we classify Norris as a high-risk area and increase patrols. Worst case, nothing changes and we wait for the next death. What about closing it permanently? Sandra asked. On what grounds? Thermal danger exists throughout Yellowstone. We can't close half the park because a ranger with 3 months' experience claims he saw a skeleton ghost. David felt anger flare, hot and immediate. Stephen has a hole in his leg from an invisible arrow. That's not a claim, it's evidence. Evidence of what? Tom's voice was tired, not dismissive. Something attacked him. We don't know what. The photos show something. But try explaining to the Department of Interior that we need to close a major tourist attraction because of indigenous mythology. It won't happen. But it did happen in a way. Over the following weeks, Norris developed a reputation. Guides began avoiding sunset tours of the thermal basin. Rangers requested transfers away from the area. Visitors reported bad feelings and strange sounds when hiking near the geyser features after dark. The Park Service responded by reducing evening access, implementing earlier closure times, increasing signage about thermal dangers. Official explanations cited increased seismic activity and thermal instability. The truth, that something hunted in the superheated waters, something that fit indigenous legends but violated modern understanding, remained contained within a small group of rangers who'd witnessed it. David completed his first season with the NPS, but the experience had transformed him. He was no longer the uncertain rookie doubting his own observations. He'd seen something impossible, fought it alongside colleagues, survived when Stephen nearly hadn't. In December, David received a letter from an anthropology professor at the University of Montana named Dr. Etta Brown Bear. She'd heard about the Norris incident through unofficial channels. The NPS network talked despite official silence, and wanted to discuss the Baycock sighting. They met at a coffee shop in Bozeman. Dr. Brown Bear was Northern Cheyenne, mid-50s, an expert in indigenous religions and mythology of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain regions. The Baycock is Ojibwe, she explained over coffee. But similar entities exist across North American indigenous traditions. The Shoshone, who consider Yellowstone sacred territory, have their own stories about spirits that hunt near thermal features. They call them Ninimbi, Deathwalkers. Different name, same concept. Skeletal guardians that protect places where the boundary between life and death is thin. Guardians? David asked. It killed someone. It tried to kill us. From the spirit's perspective, you were intruders. Yellowstone was indigenous land for 11,000 years before white settlers created a national park. The thermal features were sacred, places where the earth spoke, where spirits moved between worlds. Your park boundaries don't mean anything to entities that predate human politics by millennia. David considered this. So what do? We can't give Yellowstone back to the tribes, and we can't let people be hunted by skeleton spirits. You do what your ancestors should have done originally, Dr. Brown Bear said quietly. Acknowledge the land's original inhabitants. Recognize that some places require respect beyond scientific management. Learn the protocols that indigenous peoples developed over thousands of years of coexistence with these entities. She provided David with contact information for Shoshone tribal elders, people who might be willing to share traditional knowledge about managing spiritual threats in Yellowstone. Some agreed to meet, others declined, understandably skeptical of the NPS that had displaced their ancestors seeking guidance only after rangers had been injured. David spent his off-season learning, listening, trying to understand perspectives that his education had systematically erased. He learned about tobacco offerings, about prayers spoken in Shoshone that requested permission before entering sacred areas, about the importance of approaching thermal features with humility rather than entitlement. When he returned to Yellowstone for the 2020 season, a season that would be disrupted by pandemic closures, but that's another story, David carried knowledge that wasn't in any NPS training manual. He taught willing colleagues about indigenous protocols, about treating the park as living territory rather than managed landscape, about recognizing that rangers were guests in spaces with rules older than their institutions. The Baycock wasn't seen again, or at least not reported officially. But Norris Geyser Basin maintained its reputation. Experienced rangers felt the wrongness there, the sense of being watched by attention that preceded human presence in the region. Stephen Torres recovered but transferred to Grand Canyon National Park, unable to return to Yellowstone without panic attacks. Sandra stayed, becoming one of David's strongest allies in trying to implement indigenous perspectives in park management. David kept all the documentation, photos, thermal imaging, incident reports, his correspondence with Dr. Brown Bear, evidence of the moment his understanding expanded to accommodate reality more complex than his training had suggested. On quiet nights at the Norris Patrol Cabin, which David now volunteered for despite its isolation, he would sometimes hear clicking sounds in the darkness beyond the windows. Not threatening, just present. A reminder that the land remembered its history even if the nation built atop it chose to forget. David had come to Yellowstone as a rookie, uncertain and overwhelmed by vast responsibility. He left his first season transformed, carrying knowledge that most rangers never acquired, that the natural world included elements that defied scientific paradigms, that indigenous wisdom preserved truth that Western institutions dismissed as superstition, that being a good ranger meant respecting powers beyond human authority. The Baycock hunted still, David believed, but perhaps it hunted with discrimination, targeting those who approached the land with arrogance, who ignored warnings, who believed human dominion extended to spaces that predated human presence. Sophia Carr had been experienced but alone, hiking at night through territory that indigenous peoples would have recognized as spiritually dangerous. She'd been brave and the land had killed her, not as punishment, but as consequence of violating protocols she'd never been taught. David worked to change that. He pushed for indigenous consultation in park management, for educational materials that acknowledged the land's spiritual dimensions, for training that prepared rangers to encounter more than wildlife and weather. Most of his colleagues thought he'd gone native, become too sympathetic to indigenous perspectives, lost objectivity. But the ones who'd been at Norris that day understood. They'd seen the Baycock. They'd felt invisible arrows pass close enough to kill. They knew that the world contained more than their training acknowledged. And on October evenings, when David conducted sunset patrols near thermal features, he carried tobacco wrapped in red cloth, a traditional offering. Before approaching hot springs and geysers, he spoke quiet words in broken Shoshone, requesting permission, acknowledging that he walked as a guest in territory that remembered when his people were invaders. Sometimes the clicking sounds came, sometimes they didn't. David learned to interpret the difference, when he was tolerated, when he was warned, when he needed to retreat. The NPS never officially acknowledged the supernatural, but policies changed slowly. More indigenous consultation, more respect for traditional knowledge, more recognition that managing wilderness meant understanding it included dimensions beyond scientific measurement. David Ramirez had joined the Park Service wanting to protect nature. He learned that nature included forces that protected themselves, that his role was less guardian than negotiator, less authority than guest in territories with histories deeper than his nation's entire existence. And in Norris Geyser Basin, where superheated water rose from magma chambers miles below, where the Earth's thin crust trembled with volcanic pressure, where a skeletal guardian hunted those who forgot their place in the old order of things, there David learned humility. The Baycock was still there, would always be there, and David had made peace with that, understanding finally that some mysteries didn't require solving, only respecting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The Canon EOS 5D Mark II had been submerged in Hidden Lake for 3 days before hikers found it wedged between rocks at the shoreline. The camera body was ruined, water damage destroying the electronics, but the CF memory card survived. Emily Sorensen downloaded the images in the Glacier National Park Ranger Station, expecting the usual tourist shots, wildflowers, mountain vistas, maybe a bear at a safe distance. Instead, She found 93 photographs documenting Nathan Drake's final 36 hours. Each image time-stamped, each one progressively more disturbing than the last. The early photos were normal. Nathan at the trailhead, backpack secured, grinning at the camera held at arm's length. The classic selfie of someone embarking on a solo backcountry adventure. He was 34 from Seattle, an amateur photographer who'd obtained permits for a 3-day hike through Glacier's remote northern sector. His emergency contact, his sister in Portland, had reported him missing when he'd failed to check in on September 18, 2011. Emily clicked through the images chronologically. Nathan hiking along the trail, a marmot on a boulder, the sun setting over mountains that rose like cathedral spires against an impossibly blue Montana sky. Then around photo 47 things changed. The image showed Nathan's campsite at dusk, tent pitched near the tree line, hidden lake visible in the background. But in the lower right corner, barely visible in the failing light, a figure stood among the pines. Too distant to make out features, but the posture suggested someone watching, motionless, for however long it took Nathan to notice and snap the photo. Emily zoomed in on her laptop screen. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like dark clothing or perhaps just shadow. The resolution wasn't good enough to determine details, but something about the stance felt wrong. Too still, too focused, predatory, in a way that made Emily's ranger instincts flare with warning. The next several photos were blurred, as if Nathan had been moving quickly, or his hands had been shaking. One showed the interior of his tent, equipment scattered in what might have been hasty packing. Another captured the forest at night, flash creating harsh contrasts, illuminating tree trunks like bone-white pillars against absolute darkness. Photo 53 showed the figure again, closer now. Close enough that Emily could make out a face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that caught the camera flash and reflected it back like an animal's tapetum lucidum. Except humans didn't have reflective eyes. Humans didn't stand motionless in the forest while someone photographed them at close range. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She'd been with Glacier's law enforcement division for 11 years, the last 5 as a supervisory ranger, responsible for search and rescue coordination. She'd seen bodies recovered from avalanches, from falls, from exposure and wildlife attacks and human stupidity. But these photos suggested something different, something that made her professional detachment waver. The images continued. Nathan running, the camera bouncing, capturing disjointed fragments, trail, sky, trees, his own boots as he stumbled. Then a series of photos taken from inside his tent, flash showing the nylon walls, his face reflected in the tent fabric's interior surface, eyes wide with fear. And outside the tent, visible through the translucent nylon, multiple shadows. 3, maybe 4 figures, circling, patient. Photo 68 showed daylight again. Nathan had survived the night. The image captured his camp in morning light, everything apparently normal except for the footprints. Dozens of them, bare feet in the dirt around his tent, pressed deep despite the dry ground, toe impressions showing abnormally long digits. Emily photographed her laptop screen with her phone, capturing the footprint image. She'd need to compare these to known wildlife tracks, though she already knew they wouldn't match. Too humanoid, too deliberate in their placement. The later photos documented Nathan's apparent flight. Hasty shots of trail markers, GPS unit readings, his map spread on the ground as he tried to determine position. One image showed his face in extreme close-up, probably accidental, but Emily could see the exhaustion and terror etched there. Dirt streaked his cheeks. His eyes showed that 1,000-yard stare of someone pushed past normal stress into regions where the mind began protecting itself through dissociation. Photo 84 showed the figure in full daylight. It stood perhaps 20 yards from Nathan's position, fully visible, impossible to dismiss as shadow or imagination. The thing was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, over 7 feet, emaciated to the point where bones pressed against skin that had the gray-blue pallor of a corpse several days into decomposition. Its face was elongated, jaw distended, mouth hanging open to reveal teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp, arranged in rows that suggested shark more than mammal. But the eyes were the worst part. They held intelligence, recognition. This wasn't an animal. It was something that had been human, or something that knew what humans were and how to hunt them. The final photos were chaotic. Nathan running again, the camera capturing whatever happened to be in front of him. Lakefront, rocks, sky. Then a series of images that showed water. Hidden lake, Emily realized. Nathan had reached the lake. Several photos taken from chest-deep water, showing the shoreline, the forest, the figures emerging from the trees. 3 of them now, clearly visible. All sharing that same corpse pallor, that same impossible height. Those same predatory eyes that reflected light with colors humans shouldn't produce. Yellows and reds, like flames behind glass. Photo 92 showed one figure wading into the water, moving with purpose despite the cold that should have shocked any living system. Glacier's alpine lakes were snowmelt, temperatures hovering just above freezing even in September. The final image, photo 93, was black. Complete darkness, or perhaps the camera had been underwater when the shot was taken. The timestamp read, September 17, 2011, 6:47 p.m. Nathan Drake had not been seen since. Emily sat back from the laptop, her hands trembling slightly. She'd expected this assignment to be straightforward. Coordinate the search, recover a body. Statistics said Nathan was dead after this many days. File the appropriate reports. Return home to Kalispell and her 2 daughters who were staying with her mother while Emily worked this case. Instead, she had 93 photographs suggesting something that violated her understanding of how the world worked. Her phone rang. Emily checked the caller ID, her mother. "Hi, Mom." "Emily, honey, the girls are asking when you'll be home." "I told them probably tonight." Emily looked at the laptop screen, at the image of the figure wading into Hidden Lake, hunting Nathan Drake with the patience of something that didn't need to eat or sleep or rest, something that could pursue prey until exhaustion made resistance impossible. "I need another day, maybe 2. We found the missing hiker's camera. There are some complications with the case." "Complications?" Her mother's voice carried concern. "Emily, you've been working too much. Sarah's school play is Friday. You promised you'd be there." "I know. I will be. I just need to close this case first." After she hung up, Emily sat with the guilt that had become her constant companion since her husband Mark's death 3 years ago. Heart attack at 37, sudden and catastrophic, leaving Emily with 2 daughters to raise and a job that required weeks away from home. Her mother helped, but Emily knew she was leaning too hard on that support, knew her girls needed their mother more than the park needed another ranger. But she also knew that if she walked away from this case, if she filed a report claiming Nathan Drake died from exposure or animal attack, she would be lying. And lies in official reports meant the next person who encountered these things would be unprepared, endangered by Emily's choice to prioritize comfort over truth. Emily copied all 93 photos to an encrypted drive, then began researching. The figures in the images didn't match any known wildlife. Bears, moose, elk. She knew their profiles intimately. These were bipedal, intelligent, hunting with coordination that suggested planning rather than instinct. She pulled up historical records for the Hidden Lake area. 3 disappearances in the past 20 years, all solo hikers, all in September or October. 2 bodies had been recovered, one from the lake, one from a rockfall area a mile north. The 3rd person, a woman named Catherine Chen from Vancouver, had never been found despite extensive searches. Emily felt ice crystallize in her chest. The prohibited name. Not Sarah Chen, but Catherine Chen. She pulled up the full case file from 2006. Catherine had been 31, experienced backpacker hiking alone on a permitted route. Her last journal entry mentioned feeling watched and unusual wildlife behavior, birds avoiding certain areas. The body recovered from Hidden Lake in 2009 showed unusual trauma. Emily read the medical examiner's report with growing dread. Multiple bite marks, pattern inconsistent with known predators. Evidence of exsanguination beyond what the visible wounds could explain. Post-mortem, the ME had been careful to emphasize post-mortem. Someone or something had been feeding on the corpse. Emily stood, needing movement, needing to escape the claustrophobic ranger station. Outside, September afternoon sun illuminated Glacier's peaks. Mountains carved by ice over millions of years, rising 10,000 feet into air so clear it hurt to see. Beautiful and deadly, this landscape killed people every year through falls and exposure and simple mistakes that nature punished without mercy. But what if nature wasn't the only predator? Emily radioed Tom Jackson, the lead ranger for the Northern District. "Tom, I'm heading to Hidden Lake to investigate the Drake case. Need to examine the site where the camera was recovered." "Copy that. Want company?" Emily hesitated. Standard protocol said yes. Never investigate alone. But she didn't know what she was investigating, didn't know how to explain the photos without sounding delusional. "Negative. I'm just doing a preliminary survey. If I find anything significant, I'll call for backup." "Your call. Be safe. Weather's changing. We've got a front moving in tonight." Emily packed her emergency gear. Motorola radio, GPS, first aid, water, food, headlamp, space blanket. She also packed her Glock 22, .40 caliber rounds that she'd qualified with but hoped never to use. The weapon felt heavier than usual. Or perhaps Emily just felt the weight of decisions she might have to make. The drive to Hidden Lake Trailhead took 90 minutes through some of the most spectacular scenery in North America. Going to the Sun Road wound through terrain that changed from dense forest to alpine meadow to bare rock above treeline. Emily barely noticed. Her mind kept returning to the photos, to those figures with their corpse pallor and predatory patience. She reached the trailhead at 3:30 p.m. The hike to Hidden Lake covered 3 miles with 1,500 feet of elevation gain. Emily made good time, her body remembering the rhythm of mountain travel, even as her mind wrestled with what she might find. Hidden Lake appeared at 5:15 p.m., a pristine alpine tarn surrounded by peaks still bearing last winter's snow. The water was impossible blue, that distinctive glacial melt color created by suspended rock flour, beautiful and lethal. Swimmers lasted minutes in water this cold. Emily found the spot where hikers had recovered Nathan's camera, marked with survey tape by the initial search team. She photographed everything: the rock placement, the shoreline features, the sight lines to and from the location. Then she noticed the camp. Nathan's tent still stood 50 yards back from the lake, partially collapsed but intact. The search team had missed it, focused on the water where the camera had been found. Emily approached carefully, documenting with photographs, looking for evidence that might explain what had happened. The tent's interior showed signs of hasty abandonment. Nathan's sleeping bag lay half unzipped. His cookware sat unused. Most telling was the journal, water damaged but partially legible. Emily photographed each page, reading entries that tracked Nathan's growing fear. The first night's entry was routine. Great campsite. Hidden Lake is even more beautiful than photos. Saw what might have been a wolf in the distance, but it didn't approach. The second night. Something circled my tent last night. Not a bear, the sounds were wrong. Bipedal, I think. In the morning, found footprints, but they don't match any track guide I have. Considering packing up early, but don't want to admit I'm spooked. The final entry, written in handwriting that deteriorated into barely legible scrawl. They're not animals. 3 of them. They watch me during the day from the tree line. At night, they come closer. They don't communicate, but I can tell they're coordinating, planning. I'm going to try to reach the lake, maybe swim to the far shore. They don't like water. Yesterday, one of them stopped at the edge. If I can. The entry ended mid-sentence, ink trailing off as if Nathan had been interrupted or had fled while writing. Emily stood in the abandoned camp as afternoon light angled toward evening, reading the journal while fighting the urge to run. Nathan Drake had documented his stalking, recorded his fear, identified patterns in his predator's behavior. And then he'd attempted escape via the lake, which explained the underwater photos, the camera wedged in rocks after Nathan had dropped it or lost it while swimming. But had he made it? Had Nathan reached the far shore and continued fleeing, leaving his camera behind? Or had the things that hunted him proven capable of pursuing prey even into freezing water? Emily radioed the station. "Tom, I've located Drake's campsite. Tent is still standing. Found his journal. He describes being stalked by something he identified as bipedal, multiple entities hunting in coordination. Static, then Tom's voice. Stalked by what? Bears? Negative. His description doesn't match any known wildlife. I'm going to search the far shore of the lake, see if I can pick up his trail. Emily, the weather front is moving faster than predicted. You've got maybe 90 minutes before it hits. That's not enough time for a thorough search. Emily looked at the sky. Clouds were building over the western peaks, the kind of rapid formation that preceded Montana's violent autumn storms. Tom was right. Protocol said return to lower elevation before weather threatened safety. But protocol also said don't leave missing persons cases unsolved when evidence was available. And Emily kept thinking about her daughters, kept imagining if one of them went missing and the investigating ranger gave up because of bad weather. I'll be quick. Just want to check the obvious routes from the lake. She began working around Hidden Lake's perimeter, searching for tracks, disturbed vegetation, anything suggesting Nathan had emerged from the water. The shoreline was mostly rock, making tracking difficult, but Emily had years of experience reading landscapes. Halfway around the lake, she found blood. Just a few drops on granite, already dried to rust brown. The pattern suggested someone had paused here, dripping from wounds, before continuing into the forest. Emily followed the trail, marking her route with orange survey tape, maintaining radio contact with the station. The blood led up a steep slope, away from the lake, into dense pine forest, where afternoon light died into premature twilight. She found Nathan's body at 6:30 p.m., just as the first raindrops began falling. He lay in a small clearing, curled on his side, arms wrapped around his torso as if he'd died, trying to hold himself together. Emily approached with professional detachment, documenting the scene with photographs, noting position and condition. The cause of death was immediately apparent: massive trauma to the throat, tissue torn away with violence that suggested animal attack. But the wound pattern was wrong. Too precise, almost surgical in places, as if whatever killed Nathan had known exactly where to bite to sever the carotid artery with minimal damage to surrounding structures. More disturbing were the secondary wounds, bite marks along his arms and legs, each showing the same surgical precision. The bites had bled minimally, which Emily's training told her meant they'd been inflicted post-mortem, after Nathan's heart stopped pumping. Someone or something had been feeding on Nathan Drake's corpse. Emily keyed her radio. "Tom, I've found him. Nathan Drake is deceased, requesting immediate backup and medical examiner transport." "Copy that. What's the cause of death?" Emily looked at the body, at the wounds that would generate questions she couldn't answer with official language. "Animal attack, trauma to the throat. But there are unusual aspects to the wounds. We'll need a full forensic examination." "Understood. I'm dispatching a team, but the weather's deteriorating fast. They might not reach you until morning. Can you secure the site overnight?" Emily looked at the darkening forest, at the rain intensifying from drizzle to downpour, at Nathan's mutilated body lying in the clearing. Every instinct screamed to leave, to hike back to the trailhead and wait for backup in safety. But leaving meant the site would be unprotected overnight, evidence potentially contaminated or destroyed, and if the things that killed Nathan were still in the area. "I'll secure the site," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Setting up camp now." She erected her tent 50 yards from the body, maintaining visual contact while creating some psychological distance. The rain became torrential, that distinctively cold Montana rain that presaged early snow. Emily worked quickly, securing her camp, establishing a perimeter with survey tape, documenting everything before darkness made photography impossible. By 8 p.m., full night had fallen. Emily sat in her tent with her laptop, reviewing the photos she'd taken, trying to make sense of what had killed Nathan Drake. The wounds showed bite patterns from something with human-like teeth, but arranged differently, multiple rows suggesting a mouth that could unhinge like a snake's. The precision of the bites indicated intelligence, purpose beyond simple feeding. And the fact that most bites occurred post-mortem suggested the attack wasn't driven by hunger, but by something else. Ritual, perhaps. or a pattern Emily's framework couldn't accommodate. She pulled up research files, searching for any folklore that matched what she'd observed. The figures in Nathan's photos, corpse pale, unnaturally tall, moving with predatory coordination, didn't match Native American traditions she was familiar with. Blackfeet stories mentioned dangerous spirits, but nothing quite like this. Emily expanded her search, looking at European folklore. Eastern European, specifically, where traditions of revenants and vampiric entities were documented across multiple cultures. She found it in Romanian mythology. Strigoi. The descriptions matched almost perfectly. Strigoi were undead beings that returned after death, maintaining their intelligence and personality, but transformed into something predatory. They drank blood but could also consume flesh. They moved at night, but weren't destroyed by daylight, just made weaker. They hunted alone or in groups, showing coordination that suggested retained human cognitive ability, most relevant to Emily's situation. Strigoi were territorial, claiming areas and defending them against intruders. They could be destroyed by fire, decapitation, or stake through the heart. Traditional methods, Emily noted with grim amusement, that ranger training didn't cover. But why would Romanian folklore appear in Montana? Emily dug deeper, finding information about Romanian immigration to North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Small communities had established themselves throughout the Mountain West, drawn by mining opportunities and landscape that reminded them of the Carpathians. A specific detail caught Emily's attention. Romanian miners had worked in Glaciers region before the national park was established in 1910. Several had died in mining accidents, buried in unmarked graves when the mines closed and populations dispersed. Emily pulled up geological surveys, overlaying them with historical mining claims. Hidden Lake sat directly above a network of abandoned mine tunnels, sealed decades ago, forgotten except in historical records that nobody consulted anymore. Her radio crackled. Emily grabbed it, expecting Tom with an update on the backup team. Instead, she heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, amplified by the radio's speakers. Not electronic interference, actual respiration, transmitted from somewhere close enough to access her frequency. "Who is this?" Emily demanded, her hand moving to her Glock. The breathing continued for 10 seconds, then a voice, layered, wrong, like multiple speakers talking slightly out of sync. "You found him." Emily's professional calm shattered. "Identify yourself. This is an emergency frequency. We gave him 3 days. He ran. They always run." The transmission ended with a click. Emily stared at the radio, her training and experience providing no framework for what she'd just heard. Someone or something had accessed her frequency, spoken about Nathan Drake like he'd been prey in a hunt, used pronouns that suggested multiple entities sharing communication. Emily grabbed her Glock, turned on her headlamp, unzipped her tent. The rain had stopped, replaced by absolute silence. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing but the sound of her own breathing amplified by fear. Her headlamp beam cut through darkness, illuminating trees and rain-wet rocks and nothing else. Emily scanned the perimeter, looking for the figures from Nathan's photos, seeing only forest. Then her light caught eyes. Yellow-red, reflecting like an animal's but positioned 7 feet off the ground. Too high, too human in spacing and orientation. Emily aimed her Glock, the weapon feeling pathetic against something that had killed Nathan Drake with surgical precision. "Glacier National Park law enforcement. Identify yourself." The eyes moved, circling her position. Other eyes appeared, 3 pairs total, surrounding her camp. One of them spoke, that same layered voice she'd heard on the radio. "You have family. 2 daughters, Sarah and Emma." Emily felt her breath stop. Her daughters' names in that inhuman voice, proof that whatever these things were, they'd been watching her, learning about her, preparing the same hunt that had killed Nathan Drake. "Stay away from them," Emily managed, her voice raw with terror and rage. "We stay here. You came to us. Just Like Drake. The figures moved closer, entering the range of Emily's headlamp. She saw them clearly now, 3 entities matching Nathan's photographs exactly. Corpse pallor, elongated features, mouths that opened too wide. But the intelligence in their eyes was unmistakable. These weren't mindless undead. They were aware, calculating, hunting with purpose refined over decades or centuries. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer," Emily said, knowing how absurd it sounded, how meaningless human authority was to things that existed outside human frameworks. "Leave now, or I will use lethal force." The lead figure tilted its head, studying Emily like an entomologist might examine a pinned insect. "Bullets won't stop us. We've been shot before." It moved its hand, indicating its torso. Emily's headlamp caught evidence. Old wounds, bullet holes that had healed imperfectly, leaving puckered scar tissue across gray-blue skin. Fire works. Wood through heart works. But you have no fire. And you're alone. The truth of that hit Emily like cold water. She was alone, miles from backup, armed with weapons that these things claimed were useless. Her radio was compromised. They could access her frequency, which meant calling for help might just inform them about response team movements. But Emily had something the Strigoi didn't expect. She wasn't Nathan Drake. She wasn't a civilian, unfamiliar with backcountry survival and emergency protocols. She was a ranger with 11 years of experience, a mother with 2 daughters who needed her, and a woman who'd survived her husband's death and built a life from the ruins. She wasn't easy prey. Emily made her decision instantly. She fired 3 shots at the lead Strigoi center mass exactly as training prescribed. The thing staggered but didn't fall, validating its claim that bullets weren't lethal. But the shots created chaos, disruption, surprise. Emily used those seconds to grab her pack and run, abandoning the tent and campsite, fleeing into forest that she knew from years of patrol work. Behind her, the Strigoi's voice echoed through the darkness. "Run." Drake ran, too. Emily ran with desperate purpose, using her headlamp sparingly, navigating by memory and training through forest that wanted to kill her with falls and cliffs and unstable ground. The Strigoi followed, their coordination evident in how they spread out, cutting off escape routes, herding Emily like wolves with a deer. But Emily wasn't heading randomly. She had a destination, the abandoned mining tunnels that geological surveys showed in this area. Old mines had shafts, vertical descents that might be defensible, confined spaces where the Strigoi's numbers wouldn't matter. She found the mine entrance at 11 p.m. A timber-reinforced opening partially collapsed, marked with warning signs about unsafe conditions. Emily squeezed through the gap, descending into darkness that her headlamp barely penetrated. The mine extended deep into the mountain, tunnels branching in multiple directions. Emily moved quickly, leaving survey tape to mark her route, searching for a defensible position. Behind her, she heard the Strigoi entering the mine. Their voices echoed through the passages. Clever, but we know these tunnels. We died here." Emily stopped, that statement rearranging her understanding. The Strigoi weren't random monsters. They were the Romanian miners, the men who died in these tunnels over a century ago, buried in collapses or accidents, their bodies remaining underground while something turned them into predatory revenants. This was their territory, the mine, the forest above, hidden lake, all of it claimed by dead men who'd become something that hunted the living. Emily found a side passage, narrow and deep, ending in a small chamber where collapse had sealed further progress. She positioned herself in the chamber, Glock ready, headlamp extinguished to save battery. In absolute darkness, she waited. The Strigoi approached. Emily could hear them moving through the tunnels, could hear their breathing echoing off stone walls. 3 of them, she reminded herself. 3 against 1 in their territory and darkness that gave them advantage. But Emily had something they might not expect. She pulled out road flares from her emergency kit, struck one against the igniter. The flare burst into brilliant red flame, magnesium burning at temperatures that made the confined space feel instantly hotter. The Strigoi screamed, not the layered voice they'd used for speech, but pure anguished sound. Animal pain from entities that remembered being human. They retreated from the flare's light, and Emily understood. They weren't lying about fire being effective. The light and heat damaged them in ways bullets couldn't. Emily advanced with the flare held high, pushing the Strigoi back through the tunnels. She struck a second flare, then a third, creating a moving perimeter of flame that forced them to retreat. But flares burned for only 15 minutes. Emily had 6 total. 90 minutes of protection, after which she'd be defenseless again. She needed a permanent solution. Emily navigated through the mine tunnels, following signs that led toward the main shaft, the vertical descent that had once allowed ore and miners to move between surface and deep workings. If she could reach the surface, could get to open air and daylight. The shaft appeared ahead, a vertical opening with collapsed elevator mechanism and ladder rungs set into stone walls. Emily looked up, seeing stars through the opening 50 feet above, beautiful and distant and representing survival. She began climbing, flares strapped to her pack, Glock holstered. Below, the Strigoi gathered, watching with those yellow-red eyes, waiting. Emily climbed with methodical focus, not looking down, counting rungs, breathing steadily despite exhaustion and terror. 30 feet, 40 feet. She could smell night air, could feel the temperature dropping as she ascended toward the surface. Then a hand grabbed her ankle. Emily looked down. One of the Strigoi had begun climbing, moving with impossible speed, scaled the shaft in seconds that should take minutes. Its grip was ice cold and unnaturally strong, fingers wrapped around her leg like steel bands. Emily kicked, slamming her free boot into the Strigoi's face. It didn't release. She kicked again, frantically, knowing that if it pulled her down she was dead. Her daughters would grow up without their mother, and these things would continue hunting in Glacier's backcountry. Her boot connected with the Strigoi's eye socket. The thing's grip loosened fractionally. Emily pulled a flare, struck it one-handed, thrust it directly into the Strigoi's face. The entity shrieked, released her leg, fell backward into darkness. Emily heard it hit the shaft bottom 50 feet below, heard bone impact stone with sounds that should kill anything living. But the Strigoi weren't living. Emily climbed faster, hearing multiple entities ascending now, coordinating their pursuit. She reached the surface at 1:30 a.m., pulled herself over the shaft rim, rolled away from the opening. The Strigoi emerged seconds later, 3 figures rising from the mine shaft like bodies floating to the surface of still water. They stood in the night, circling Emily, no longer pretending to be human, jaws unhinging to show those multiple rows of teeth, hands extending to reveal fingers too long and tipped with yellow nails. Emily had 1 flare remaining. She struck it, holding the fire between herself and the closest entity. "Fire burns us," the lead Strigoi said, its voice carrying something like respect. "But you run out of fire. We never run out of hunger." It was stating fact, not threatening. Emily stood in the Montana darkness, 3 undead Romanian miners surrounding her, armed with a flare that would burn for 12 more minutes. The nearest help was hours away. Her radio was compromised. Her daughters were sleeping in Kalispell, unaware their mother was fighting for her life against folklore made real. Emily thought about Mark, about the promise she'd made at his funeral, that she'd be there for their girls, that she'd come home. She thought about Nathan Drake, who'd run and died alone. She thought about Catherine Chen, missing and never found, probably consumed by these same entities years ago. Then she thought about something Tom had said earlier. Weather's changing. Emily pulled out her GPS, checked her position. She was standing less than a quarter mile from the edge of the Continental Divide, where Montana's autumn storms gathered force before sweeping down eastern slopes. She started walking, flare held high, heading upslope toward the divide. The Strigoi followed, maintaining distance from the fire but pacing her movement, patient. "You climb, but There's nowhere to go. This is our territory. Not all of it, Emily said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. You claimed the forest, the mine, but not the high country. She kept climbing, exhaustion making each step agony, cold wind cutting through her ranger jacket. The Strigoi followed, their confidence showing in their casual pace. They knew Emily was running out of options, knew the flare would die soon. Emily reached the divide at 2:15 a.m., standing on a narrow ridge where wind howled with freight train force, where clouds built into towering formations that would soon release the season's first major snow. Her flare had 3 minutes of burn time remaining. Last chance, the lead Strigoi said, close enough now that Emily could smell it. Decay and earth and something chemical, like preservatives failing to prevent rot. Join us. We remember being alive. Remember families. Remember fear. We can make it stop. Emily understood the offer. Transformation instead of death. Become one of them. Join their pack. Hunt in these mountains for decades or centuries. Never feel fear or loss or the weight of survival again. It was almost tempting. But Emily thought about Sarah and Emma, about being the thing that stalked them if she accepted transformation, about becoming the entity that killed Nathan Drake instead of the ranger who tried to save him. No, Emily said simply. She threw the flare over the edge of the divide, watching it tumble down the eastern slope, a diminishing point of light falling into darkness. The Strigoi moved forward, confident now that Emily's fire was gone. Then lightning struck. The storm front, building pressure all evening, finally reached critical mass. Lightning forked across the sky in brilliant branches, striking the divide with voltage that made Emily's hair stand on end. Thunder followed instantly, concussive force that made the ground shudder. The Strigoi screamed. Lightning struck again, closer, drawn by the altitude and exposed rock. One bolt connected directly with the lead entity, electricity flowing through dead flesh, incinerating it from within. The Strigoi exploded into ash and fragments, destroyed by natural fire more powerful than any flare. The remaining two entities fled, disappearing down the western slope, retreating into forest away from the divide's exposure. Emily stood in the lightning storm, alive by chance or miracle, exhausted beyond measure. She activated her radio. The storm's interference would mask any Strigoi attempts to intercept. Tom, this is Emily. I'm on the Continental Divide north of Hidden Lake. Request immediate evacuation and backup. Multiple hostiles in the area. Drake is deceased. I need extraction. Tom's response was nearly lost in static. Emily? Jesus, we've been trying to reach you for hours. Helicopter is inbound, ETA 30 minutes. Can you hold position? Affirmative. Holding position. Emily sat down on cold rock, letting exhaustion claim her. Trusting that help was coming, that she'd see her daughters again, that she'd survived because she'd understood something Nathan Drake hadn't. The Strigoi could hunt in forest and mines and darkness, but they were vulnerable in exposed places where nature's violence exceeded even undead predation. The helicopter found her at 3:45 a.m., searchlight cutting through the storm, winch lowering to pull her to safety. Emily grabbed the rescue line, letting herself be lifted from the divide, from the territory where dead miners hunted the living, from the backcountry that had tried to keep her forever. At the hospital in Kalispell, doctors treated her for exposure and exhaustion. Park administration debriefed her, asking careful questions about what had happened. Emily told them most of the truth. Nathan Drake's body was in the clearing, killed by something she'd encountered. Entities that matched descriptions from European folklore, hostile and intelligent, and still at large. The official report classified it as an animal attack. Cause unknown, investigation ongoing. Hidden Lake was closed indefinitely, the abandoned mine shafts sealed with concrete and steel. Warning signs posted about dangerous wildlife, though the real danger was never specified. Emily took medical leave, spending October with Sarah and Emma, attending school plays and soccer games, relearning how to be a mother instead of a ranger. But she kept Nathan's photos on her encrypted drive, kept copies of his journal entries and her research about Strigoi. In December, she received a letter from Romanian Orthodox Church in Denver. A priest had heard about the glacier incident through unofficial channels, wanted to discuss proper protocols for dealing with Strigoi incursions. The letter included prayers in Romanian, instructions for creating blessed items, contact information for others who'd encountered similar entities. Emily met with Father Ionescu in January, learning that the Strigoi weren't isolated to glacier, that similar entities existed in wilderness areas across North America, where Eastern European immigrants had died and been buried without proper Orthodox funerary rites. The Church had been tracking these manifestations for decades, quietly intervening when possible, losing believers when intervention failed. "You survived," Father Ionescu told Emily, "because you understood that territory matters. Strigoi are tied to the place they died. They can't leave, can't abandon their claim. All you could do was find the edge of their territory and step beyond it." Emily nodded, thinking about the continental divide, about lightning as natural fire, about how thin the line was between survival and becoming another missing person statistic. She returned to work in March, requesting transfer to Glacier's administrative division. She still coordinated searches, still reviewed missing persons cases, but she didn't go into the backcountry anymore. Couldn't go, not after Hidden Lake, not after seeing what hunted there. Other rangers noticed the change. Whispers started about Emily losing her edge, about trauma making her ineffective. She didn't argue. Let them think she was broken. Better that than explaining the truth, that she'd survived by pure chance, that the Strigoi still hunted in the high country, that anyone who disappeared near Hidden Lake was probably dead or worse. On quiet nights, Emily would pull up Nathan's photos, studying the progression from normal vacation shots to evidence of stalking, to documentation of entities that shouldn't exist. She'd made copies for Father Ionescu, for the Orthodox Church's archive of supernatural incidents. But she kept the originals, reminder of the case that had taught her the most important lesson. The wilderness contained more than weather and wildlife, and some territories belonged to the dead who refused to release their claim. Sarah and Emma grew up with a mother who worked administrative hours, who was always home for dinner, who never missed school events. Emily considered it penance and privilege. She'd survived when Nathan Drake hadn't, and the price of that survival was living as if every day mattered, as if her daughter's childhoods were more important than any case. But she never forgot. Never let herself dismiss the photos as misidentification or the journal entries as panic-induced delusion. The Strigoi were real, hunting in Glacier's backcountry, waiting for the next solo hiker who wandered into their territory after dark. And sometimes, on the anniversary of Nathan Drake's death, Emily would drive to the Hidden Lake trailhead and leave a small memorial. Flowers, a candle, a prayer in Romanian that Father Ionescu had taught her. Not for Nathan specifically, though he deserved remembering, but for all the missing people who'd encountered the Strigoi over the decades, all the families who never knew the truth about what had killed their loved ones. The dead miners hunted still. Emily had survived by running until she found the edge of their territory, by holding out until nature's violence exceeded even undead predation. But she knew her survival was statistical outlier, luck masquerading as skill. And she knew that somewhere in the abandoned mine tunnels beneath Hidden Lake, 2 Strigoi remained, waiting with the patience of entities that measured time in decades, ready for the next hiker who ignored closure signs and entered their claimed ground after sunset. Emily had documented it all. The photos, the journal, the research, the Orthodox Church protocols. If something happened to her, if the Strigoi found her family, if the knowledge needed to be passed on, it was there, encrypted and backed up, evidence of the moment Montana wilderness revealed itself as territory, shared with things that remembered being human, but had chosen to become something else. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Lisa Hoffman saw the hands come through the stone. She'd been following Connor Burke through the lower cave section, their headlamps cutting narrow beams through darkness that felt ancient and absolute. Connor was 20 feet ahead, pointing out a formation of soda straws that had taken millennia to form, his voice echoing off limestone walls. Lisa was trying to memorize everything. This was only her third week as a ranger at Carlsbad Caverns, and she was still learning to navigate the labyrinth of passages that extended for miles beneath the New Mexico desert. Then Connor stopped mid-sentence, his headlamp fixed on something at his feet. "That's strange," he said, crouching to examine the cave floor. "This fissure isn't on the survey maps." Lisa moved closer, her own light joining his to illuminate a crack in the limestone, perhaps 6 inches wide and running perpendicular to their path. It looked fresh, the edges sharp and clean, without the smoothing that water would have created over geological time. "Should we report it?" Lisa asked. She'd been taught that any new cave features needed to be documented, that Carlsbad was a dynamic system still forming and changing. "Yeah, but let me just..." Connor leaned forward, trying to see how deep the fissure went. The hands came through the stone itself, not from the fissure but from the solid limestone beside it. Pale fingers, impossibly long, with nails like dirty talons. They emerged as if the rock were water, reaching up and wrapping around Connor's ankles with a speed that made Lisa's breath catch. Connor had time to say, "What?" before he was yanked downward. Not into the fissure. Through it, his body compressed in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Bones bending, flesh squeezing, as those pale hands pulled him into a gap too narrow for a human body to fit. He screamed, a sound that was cut off abruptly as his head went through, then his shoulders, his torso, until only his legs remained visible, kicking frantically. Lisa lunged forward, grabbing his boot, trying to pull him back, but the hands were impossibly strong, and the limestone beneath her own feet was suddenly soft, yielding as if reality itself had decided that solid rock could be permeable when it wanted to be. Connor's legs vanished through the crack with a wet sound like meat being forced through a grinder. The fissure sealed behind him with a grinding noise, leaving only smooth limestone that showed no evidence of ever having been broken. Lisa fell backward, her hand still clutching empty air where Connor's boot had been. Her headlamp beam swept across stone that was completely, impossibly intact. No fissure, no crack, just solid rock that had swallowed her colleague in front of her eyes. She screamed Connor's name, the sound bouncing off cave walls and returning to her in mocking echoes. Then she was on her feet, running back the way they'd come, her radio already in her hand. "Code 33, code 33. Her voice was too high, too panicked. "This is Hoffman in Lower Cave. Ranger down. I repeat, Ranger down. Connor Burke has been..." Been what? Pulled through solid stone by impossible hands? Compressed and dragged into a gap 6 inches wide? Has disappeared. I need immediate backup. Something happened, something's wrong. Static burst from the radio. Then a voice she didn't recognize, speaking in a language that made her teeth ache. The words were guttural, Eastern European, possibly Romanian based on her limited exposure to foreign languages. Then, cutting through the foreign speech, a single phrase in English. "He was mine first. You are mine second." Lisa switched off the radio with shaking hands. She was still running, her headlamp beam bouncing wildly off stalactites and flowstone formations. The trail markers, reflective tape placed every 50 feet, guided her back toward the elevator that would take her to the surface, to safety, to a world where solid rock stayed solid. She'd covered maybe 200 feet when she heard the sound behind her. Footsteps on stone, too heavy to be natural, accompanied by breathing that was wet and labored, as if damaged lungs were struggling to process air. Lisa didn't look back. She ran faster, her lungs burning from the exertion and the constant 55-degree temperature of the cave. Her Petzl headlamp flickered, the battery dying despite being fresh that morning. The darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by that failing beam of light. The elevator was ahead. She could see the steel doors, the modern intrusion into this ancient place. Lisa hit the call button and immediately heard the mechanism engage, cables pulling the car up from somewhere deeper in the cave system. It would take 60 seconds to arrive. 60 seconds where she stood in the open, exposed, with those footsteps getting closer. 45 seconds. The breathing was louder now, close enough that she could hear individual gasps and rattles. 30 seconds. Lisa pressed herself against the rock wall beside the elevator doors, trying to become invisible. Her headlamp switched off to avoid giving away her position. The darkness was total, absolute in a way surface darkness never was. In this cave, light had never existed naturally. The darkness was the default state. 15 seconds. Something moved past her hiding spot. She felt the displacement of air, smelled something like old earth and decay, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, human-shaped but wrong in its proportions, the head too large, the limbs too long. The elevator dinged its arrival. The doors slid open, spilling artificial light into the cave. Lisa lunged for the opening, and as she did, something grabbed the back of her ranger jacket. She felt fingernails tear through the fabric, scraping across her skin with enough force to draw blood. Lisa threw herself forward, the jacket tearing free. She hit the elevator floor, slapping the button for the visitor center as the doors began to close. In the narrowing gap, she saw it clearly, a figure, unmistakably human in origin, but transformed by something that had nothing to do with natural processes. It had been a man once. She could see the remnants of that in the bone structure, the shape of the face beneath skin that had taken on the color and texture of cave limestone. But the eyes were wrong, too large, reflective like an animal's, glowing with a pale phosphorescence. The mouth was open, revealing teeth that had grown and sharpened, designed for tearing meat, and it wore Connor Burke's face. The elevator doors sealed, cutting off her view. Lisa lay on the floor, hyperventilating as the car began its ascent. 300 feet up, from the deepest developed section of the cave to the surface. 3 minutes of travel through solid rock while something that wore Connor's face remained below. Her radio crackled, Connor's voice but distorted, speaking with an accent that hadn't been there an hour ago when they'd entered the cave together. Lisa, sweet, inexperienced Lisa, you think the surface will save you? The Strigoi walk between worlds. I am here. I am there. I am everywhere these caves touch. Connor's dead, Lisa said into the radio, though she knew that wasn't quite right. Connor was something worse than dead. Morte dar nu mort, the thing responded. Dead but not dead. This is what waits in the deep places, in the caves where the sun never reaches. The Romanians who came here, who worked the mines nearby, they knew. They left warnings carved in stone, but who reads stone anymore? Who believes the old stories? The elevator reached the visitor center level. The doors opened to artificial lighting and the faint sound of tourist chatter from the main hall. Lisa stumbled out, her torn jacket revealing the scratches on her back, her face pale with shock. The duty ranger, an older man named Martinez who'd worked Carlsbad for 30 years, took one look at her and reached for his radio. We need EMS to the elevator bay. Hoffman is injured. What happened down there? Connor's gone, Lisa managed. Something took him. Something in the cave. Cave-in? Structural collapse? No. Something else. Something that... She stopped, seeing the expression on Martinez's face. Concern, yes, but also skepticism. If she told the truth, that she'd watched Connor be pulled through solid stone by pale hands, that she'd seen him transformed into something with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, they'd think she was having a psychological break. First-year rangers cracked sometimes, overwhelmed by the responsibility or the isolation. Something grabbed him, she said carefully. I didn't see clearly. It happened so fast. We need to send a rescue team. Martinez was already coordinating. Within 20 minutes, there was a full response. EMS checking Lisa's injuries, superficial scratches, mild shock, elevated heart rate, and a cave rescue team gearing up to descend into the lower cave section. Lisa tried to join them, but the incident commander, a man named Alvarez who'd been with the Park Service for 25 years, shut that down immediately. You're a witness, not a rescuer. You stay topside and debrief while we search. Lisa watched them descend. 5 experienced cavers with full technical gear, bright lights, and absolute confidence in their training. She wanted to warn them, to explain what was really down there, but the words wouldn't come. How did you explain that the cave itself had become hostile? that something ancient and hungry had woken up. She was placed in the park superintendent's office to wait, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the September heat outside. Through the window, she could see the desert landscape, creosote bushes and ocotillo stretching toward mountains that rose in the distance. The Guadalupe Range, honeycombed with caves, over 300 known passages in Carlsbad alone, and the unknown ones. The unmapped passages that extended for miles beneath the surface where no light had ever reached and no human had ever walked. Connor was down there. Or something wearing Connor's face was down there. Lisa's radio, still clipped to her belt, remained silent. The rescue team was using a different frequency, proper protocol for organized operations, but she kept the device on, monitoring the static, waiting for another transmission in that voice that was Connor but also something older. Something that spoke with a Romanian accent and new words like strigoi. Her laptop was on the desk. Lisa opened it and started searching, typing strigoi into the search engine. The results were immediate. Romanian folklore, vampiric entities that rose from the grave to torment the living. But not vampires in the Hollywood sense. Strigoi retained their intelligence, their memories, their personalities. They returned to familiar places and familiar people, driven by unfinished business or by the circumstances of their death. And they were specifically associated with caves in some regions. The old stories talked about strigoi that lived in underground places that avoided sunlight not because it harmed them, but because they preferred the darkness, the cold, the separation from the living world. Lisa clicked through academic papers, anthropology journals, anything that treated the folklore seriously rather than as entertainment. One article, written by a Romanian ethnographer, caught her attention. The strigoi of the deep, cave-dwelling revenants in Carpathian tradition. She skimmed the text, her hands shaking as certain phrases jumped out. Transformation occurs rapidly, within hours of death. Maintains victims' memories and speech patterns. Capable of drawing others into the cave system through supernatural means. Marks territory by leaving physical evidence on limestone surfaces. Lisa closed the laptop and grabbed her flashlight, heading for the service tunnels that connected the visitor center to the various cave entrances. Martinez tried to stop her, but she pushed past him, running down the maintenance corridor until she reached the natural entrance. The original way into Carlsbad, a massive opening in the mountainside that had been used by bats for millennia before humans ever explored the caves. The opening was gated during this time of year to protect hibernating bats, but Lisa had keys. She unlocked the gate and stepped through, her flashlight beam cutting across the massive entrance chamber. The walls here were covered with historical graffiti, names and dates going back to the 1800s when cowboys and miners had first explored the caves. But there were older marks too, ones that weren't on the historical tour. Lisa had noticed them during her training but hadn't understood their significance. Now she did. Carved into the limestone, partially obscured by newer graffiti, were symbols. Crosses with additional lines extending from the cardinal points, circles with stars inside, and words in a language she now recognized as Romanian. Aici locuiesc morții care umblă. Here dwell the walking dead. Închide piatra când soarele apune. Seal the stone when the sun sets. Ei vorbesc cu vocea celor pe care i-au luat. They speak with the voices of those they've taken. Lisa photographed the symbols with her phone, her breath misting in the cave's cool air. Someone had known. Miners, probably. Romanian immigrants who'd come to work the nearby potash mines in the early 1900s. They'd found something in these caves, something that matched their old folklore, and they'd left warnings. Warnings that had been ignored, painted over, dismissed as superstition. Her phone buzzed. A text message, somehow getting signal despite being inside the cave entrance. Unknown number. They're coming up now. The rescue team. But they're bringing something with them. Lisa's blood went cold. She ran back toward the visitor center, emerging just as the elevator dinged its arrival. The doors opened and the rescue team stumbled out. 4 men supporting a 5th who was unconscious. Their team leader, a man named Rodriguez, was pale beneath his helmet. "We found him," Rodriguez said. "Connor Burke. He's alive, but unresponsive. There's something wrong with him, something." They had Connor on a stretcher now. and Lisa could see his face. His eyes were closed, his skin the same pale limestone color she'd seen on the creature in the cave. His chest rose and fell with breath, but the breathing was wrong, too slow, too shallow, as if his lungs barely needed oxygen anymore. "Where's the fifth team member?" Martinez asked, counting the rescuers. Rodriguez looked confused. "Fifth? There were 4 of us: Jenkins, Alvarez, Morrison, and me." The roster showed 5 names. "Must be a clerical error. We only sent 4 down." But Lisa had watched 5 people descend. She was certain of it. 5 people had gone into the cave, and only 4 had come back. The missing rescuer's name was Patterson. Lisa found it on the deployment roster, written clearly in Martinez's handwriting. But when she asked Rodriguez about Patterson, the team leader looked at her like she was speaking nonsense. "There's no Patterson on the cave rescue team. Never has been." Lisa pulled up the duty roster on the computer system. Patterson's name was there, had been there when she'd looked 20 minutes ago. But now, as she watched, the letters began to fade, pixels on the screen rearranging themselves until the name was gone entirely, replaced by a notation: "Roster error, entry deleted." Reality was changing. Something in the cave was reaching up through layers of stone and time, rewriting the present to eliminate evidence of its feeding. Connor was taken to the medical clinic on site, a small facility designed to handle tourist injuries and minor emergencies. The doctors were baffled by his condition. He was cold, far colder than a living body should be, but his heart still beat with a slow, steady rhythm. His pupils didn't respond to light. His skin had taken on a texture that resembled limestone, rough and porous. Lisa stood outside the clinic watching through the window as they worked on him, and she saw the moment Connor's eyes opened. They glowed with that same pale phosphorescence she'd seen in the creature's eyes. Connor sat up, moving with sudden strength that sent the doctor stumbling backward. He turned his head, scanning the room, and his gaze locked on Lisa through the window. He smiled, revealing teeth that had sharpened, that looked designed for tearing flesh. Then he spoke, his voice carrying despite the closed window, despite the distance. "The transformation is incomplete. I need to return below. I need the darkness, the stone, the eternal cold. But first, Lisa, I need you to understand. The Strigoi doesn't just take, it offers. Eternal existence, freedom from fear, from pain, from the weakness of living flesh. Join me below. Let the cave claim you as it claimed me." "Sedate him," the doctor was shouting, but Connor moved too fast. He was off the examination table and heading for the door before anyone could react. Lisa ran, not toward the clinic, but away from it, back toward the cave entrance. She didn't have a plan. She had training that was 3 weeks old and experience that was basically non-existent. But she had one advantage. She'd seen the warnings, she'd read the folklore, and she understood something the others didn't. The Strigoi could be stopped. The Romanian texts had been clear on that. Fire was one method, complete immolation of the body. But there was another way, one more suited to a cave setting. Seal them below ground, trap them in darkness so complete that they couldn't find their way out. Lisa reached the natural entrance and grabbed the gate controls. The system was designed to close automatically at sunset to protect bat populations, but it could be manually activated. She hit the override, and the massive steel gate began to swing shut, powered by hydraulic motors. Connor appeared at the entrance to the maintenance tunnel, moving with that unnatural speed. His skin had grown paler, more stone-like, and his fingernails had lengthened into claws that scraped against the walls as he ran. "You can't seal me in," he said, his voice echoing. "The caves extend for miles. There are a dozen ways to reach the surface." "Then I'll seal all of them," Lisa said, though she had no idea how to do that. Connor stopped at the entrance to the natural entrance chamber, perhaps 20 feet from where Lisa stood. The steel gate was 3/4 closed now, narrowing the opening. "I was your mentor," Connor said, and for a moment his voice was his own again, without the Romanian accent or the inhuman timbre. "I was supposed to teach you, to keep you safe. This isn't what I wanted." "What happened to you?" Lisa asked, keeping one hand on the gate control. I woke something. When I examined that fissure, when I looked into the gap, I saw eyes looking back. Ancient eyes, and then the hands came through and they pulled me down and I died, Lisa. I felt my body compress, felt my bones break and my lungs collapse. I died in the darkness. Then what are you? What the Romanians call strigoi, what other cultures call by other names. The thing that happens when someone dies in a cave, when their last thoughts are of the surface they'll never see again. The stone absorbs us, transforms us, makes us part of the cave itself. We become the darkness. We become the hunger that all caves have, the emptiness that wants to be filled. The gate was almost closed now, just a 2-foot gap remaining. Connor moved suddenly, covering the distance with impossible speed. His hand shot through the narrowing gap, claws extending toward Lisa's throat. She hit the emergency close button. The gate slammed shut with a grinding clang, severing Connor's arm at the elbow. The limb fell to the ground, twitching, and began to crumble into limestone dust. On the other side of the gate, Connor screamed. A sound that was rage and pain and something older, a fury at being denied. Then his voice changed, speaking in Romanian, words that Lisa didn't understand, but that made her ears ring and her vision blur. She backed away from the gate, watching as the bars began to frost over despite the September heat. Ice crystals formed, spreading across the steel, and Lisa heard a grinding sound, the metal beginning to warp from supernatural cold. This wasn't over. Sealing the natural entrance wasn't enough. Connor had been right about that. There were dozens of ways to reach the surface from the cave system, the elevator, the service tunnels, the undeveloped passages that connected to other caves in the Guadalupe Range. Lisa ran back to the visitor center, finding Martinez on the radio coordinating the response to Connor's escape. "We need to seal every entrance," she said. "Every tunnel, every elevator shaft, every connection to the surface." "On what authority?" "On the authority of someone who's actually seen what's down there." "Martinez, I know how this sounds. I know you think I'm in shock or having some kind of breakdown. But Connor Burke is dead and something is wearing his body, and if we don't seal these caves right now, it's going to reach the surface and it's going to spread." Martinez studied her for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio. "This is Martinez to all units. Emergency Protocol 7. Seal all cave entrances immediately. I want every gate closed, every elevator locked down, every tunnel blocked. This is not a drill." The response was immediate. Rangers and maintenance staff scrambling to execute the order. Lisa watched on the security monitors as gates swung shut, as elevators were disabled, as the cave system was systematically isolated from the surface world. But she knew it wasn't enough. The strigoi had existed in these caves for over a century, maybe longer. They'd learned patience, they'd learned to wait. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. The Romanian miners sealed themselves in 1903, when they realized what they'd awakened. 23 men trapped below with the strigoi. Their bodies are still down there. We wear them sometimes. We remember their lives. We speak with their voices. Lisa felt sick. "How many of you are there?" The response came immediately. "Enough. 23 miners. 5 tourists who got lost over the years. 2 rangers who went too deep into undeveloped passages. And now Connor. We grow stronger with each addition. Each body is a new voice, a new memory, a new way to lure the living below. What do you want?" "The same thing all strigoi want. To not be alone. To fill the emptiness. The caves are vast, Lisa. So much darkness, so much cold. We could use company." Lisa looked at the security monitors, at the sealed entrances, at the cave system that was now completely cut off from the surface. They'd bought time, but not safety. The strigoi could wait. They had eternity. But Lisa had an idea. It was dangerous, probably suicidal. But it was better than waiting for those things to find a way out. She gathered her gear, rope, harness, 3 powerful LED lanterns, and a backpack full of supplies. Then she went to the maintenance shed and found what she needed. 10 gallons of gasoline and a case of emergency flares. Martinez tried to stop her at the service elevator. "What are you doing?" "Finishing this. The Strigoi are trapped below, but they're not destroyed. They'll wait, and eventually someone will unseal the caves. A year from now, 10 years, whenever. But if I can find their nesting place, if I can burn the bodies they're using, that's suicide. Maybe, but I'm the one who saw Connor get taken. I'm the one who survived. That means this is my responsibility." She didn't give him time to argue. Lisa entered the service elevator, the one that went deeper than the tourist routes, all the way to the undeveloped sections where the original Romanian miners had worked. She had the override key that would let her descend even with the emergency protocols active. The elevator descended for 5 minutes, dropping through layers of limestone that had taken millions of years to form. When the doors opened, Lisa stepped into a passage that had never been developed for tourism, a raw cave with no handrails or lighting, just stone and darkness and the sound of dripping water. Her LED lanterns pushed back the shadows, but they felt inadequate against the weight of all that darkness. Lisa consulted the map she'd printed from the cave survey database, a hand-drawn chart from 1903, showing passages the miners had explored and marked with Romanian notations. One chamber was marked with a symbol she now recognized, the sign for Strigoi, and a note in Romanian that she'd translated earlier. Aici dorm morții, nu trezește. Here sleep the dead, do not wake. Lisa followed the passage toward that chamber, moving carefully over slick stone. The air was cold and damp, thick with the mineral smell of limestone. Every shadow looked like it might conceal something with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. She heard them before she saw them. Voices speaking in Romanian, in English, in languages she didn't recognize. They were waiting in the darkness beyond her lights, the collective presence of 31 Strigoi, all wearing bodies that should have been buried or burned decades ago. Connor's voice emerged from the chorus. "You brought fire. That shows you've read the folklore. But Lisa, you're one person with limited fuel in a cave system that extends for miles. You can't burn us all. You can't even find us all." "I don't need to find all of you," Lisa said, entering the chamber marked on the map. "I just need to destroy your nesting place." The chamber was vast, the ceiling lost in darkness above her lights, and against the walls, arranged in crude alcoves carved into the limestone, were bodies. 30 of them, mummified by the cave's constant cool temperature and low humidity. Some wore mining clothes from the early 1900s. Others wore modern hiking gear. 2 were dressed in ranger uniforms, their badges still pinned to their chests. These were the physical anchors, Lisa realized. The Strigoi could move through the cave system, could manifest wherever the darkness was deep enough, but they needed these bodies as anchors to physical reality. Destroy the bodies, and the Strigoi would be cut off from the physical world, trapped in whatever liminal space they occupied between life and death. She poured gasoline over the nearest body, her hands shaking. The Strigoi were emerging from the darkness now, circling at the edge of her light. 30 figures with glowing eyes and pale skin, some retaining more human features than others, all watching with an intelligence that was utterly alien. "You'll trap us," Connor said, his voice coming from one of the circling figures. "Lock us in the space between, unable to manifest, unable to feed. It's a torture worse than death." "You should have stayed dead the first time," Lisa said, pulling out a road flare. Connor moved fast, covering the distance in a heartbeat, his hand wrapped around her wrist, the claws digging in deep enough to draw blood. "Join us instead. Let the cave claim you. You'll never be alone, never be afraid. The darkness will embrace you, and you'll exist forever in the stone." Lisa felt the pull of his words, felt something in the cave itself reaching for her consciousness. It would be so easy to give in, to let the transformation happen, to become part of this ancient collective that had existed in the darkness since before humans had named the stars. But she thought of the surface world, sunlight on desert sand, the smell of creosote after rain, the sight of bats emerging at dusk from the natural entrance. She thought of all the living things that needed protecting from what lurked below. Lisa struck the flare against its cap. It ignited with a brilliant red flame that sent the Strigoi recoiling, their bodies instinctively retreating from the light and heat. She dropped the flare into the gasoline-soaked alcove. The fire spread fast, engulfing the first body, then the second. The flames grew, fed by the gasoline and the dry organic matter of the mummified corpses. The Strigoi screamed, a sound like wind through narrow passages, like stone grinding on stone, like the earth itself in agony. Connor released her wrist, staggering backward. "You've murdered us," he said, his form already starting to fade, becoming translucent. "You've condemned us to eternal nothingness." "You were already condemned," Lisa said. "I'm just finishing what should have happened 100 years ago." She lit more flares, throwing them into the alcoves, watching as the fire consumed the bodies that had anchored the Strigoi to physical reality. The heat was intense, the smoke thick with the smell of burning flesh and old fabric. The Strigoi circled, desperate, trying to reach her through the flames, but the fire formed a barrier they couldn't cross. One by one, the figures faded. Connor was the last to go, his form hovering at the edge of the firelight. For a moment, his eyes were human again, filled with something that might have been gratitude or might have been rage. Then he was gone, and Lisa was alone in a chamber full of flames and smoke. She ran for the elevator, her lungs burning from the toxic fumes. The fire was spreading, igniting support timbers that the miners had left behind, consuming everything organic in the chamber. Lisa hit the elevator call button and prayed it would respond, that the smoke hadn't triggered the emergency shutdown. The doors opened. She stumbled inside and pressed the button for the surface, and the elevator began its ascent just as the fire reached the passage behind her. 5 minutes of travel through solid stone while below her the fire raged. Lisa could feel the heat through the elevator walls, could smell the smoke that was being pulled up through ventilation shafts. The cave was burning and she'd set the fire. The elevator reached the visitor center. The doors opened to chaos, smoke alarms blaring, rangers evacuating tourists, Martinez shouting orders into his radio. He grabbed Lisa's arm as she emerged. "What did you do?" "I finished it. The Strigoi are gone, but the fire suppression is already activated. CO2 systems in all the lower passages. It'll be out in 20 minutes. Martinez studied her face, seeing something there that made his expression soften. "Did you find them? The bodies?" "All of them. The miners from 1903, the lost tourists, the rangers who disappeared. They were all down there being used as anchors." "And Connor?" Lisa touched her wrist, where Connor's claws had broken skin. The wounds were already healing, closing faster than they should. Connor died the moment those hands pulled him through the stone. What came back wasn't him. It was just something wearing his face. The fire was contained within 3 hours. The lower passages were sealed permanently, marked as hazardous and removed from all future development plans. The official report listed it as an accidental ignition caused by equipment malfunction, with no mention of Strigoi or undead miners or caves that could swallow people through solid stone. Connor Burke's body was never recovered. The official story was that he'd been killed in the collapse that had trapped him, that his remains were sealed behind unstable rock. Lisa attended his memorial service and said nothing about what she'd seen, what he'd become, what he'd offered her in that burning chamber. But she kept the scars on her wrist, and sometimes late at night she felt the pull of the caves, felt something in the darkness calling her name. The Strigoi were gone, destroyed when their physical anchors burned. But the cave itself remained, and caves had memories longer than human lifespans. Lisa requested a transfer 6 months later. She was sent to Yellowstone to work above ground where sunlight could reach every day, where winter was cold but temporary, where the only darkness was the kind that came with night and could be banished with a flashlight. She never went into a cave again, not recreationally, not professionally, not even to visit tourist attractions, because she'd learned that some places exist outside human understanding, that some darkness is too deep to ever fully illuminate, and that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The caves beneath Carlsbad remained, honeycombed passages extending for miles in every direction. officially empty, officially safe. And Lisa Hoffman, who had been a ranger there for exactly 3 weeks and 4 days, never corrected that official position. Some truths were too dangerous to share. Some warnings needed to stay written in Romanian on limestone walls, waiting for someone who could read them and understand that the old stories existed for a reason. The caves kept their secrets, and Lisa kept hers. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to Patterson.